Oh, hello there. How's it going? You've caught me, or found me. You've caught me drinking coffee, surrounded by all these books. Maybe it's story time with Mr. Michael. You know, my favorite thing in the world to do is grab a nice cup of dark black coffee, surround myself with all these books, put on a tie, and read a book. So, I'm just gonna set this coffee mug right over here, carefully. And what do you think, everybody? You want to read a book? I sure do. In fact, I very specifically want to read this book. I want to read The Noisy Clock Shop by Jean Horton Berg. This book was illustrated by Art Seiden. Now, Miss Jean Horton Berg is one of America's great children's authors. She wrote more than 50 wonderful books, and I figured we better get started on them, right? So today, it's gonna be The Noisy Clock Shop. I'm really excited to find out what happens inside of it. Aren't you? And wow, look at these pictures. This book itself is beautiful. You know, like a lot of times there'll be a dust jacket. That's what they call it. Like there's a book and then it just looks kind of plain, but then they put on a really pretty fancy cover. That's called a dust jacket. Well, this is the actual cover of the book. Isn't that awesome? So, what do you think, folks? Let's find out what's inside. The Noisy Clock Shop. Story by Jean Horton Berg. Pictures by Art Seiden. Mr. Winky mended clocks. He took care of shabby clocks with dirty faces, poor old clocks with broken hands, and lazy clocks that wouldn't run. After he fixed a clock, Mr. Winky wound it. Then he would put it back on the shelf to wait for its owner to come and take it home. Mr. Winky's clock shop was a cheerful place. The clocks on the shelves kept up a constant chatter. Tickety-tick, said the little ones. Tock, tock, said the big ones. The Swiss clock sang a tinkly little song. The cuckoo popped out of the cuckoo clock and said, cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo. The grandfather clock tried to chime first, but the cuckoo clock always beat him. One day, Mr. Winky was sitting at his workbench enjoying all the ticks and tocks and ting-a-lings and dings and dongs and cuckoos and bong-bongs when the door of the shop flew open. "Hello, Mr. Glum," said Mr. Winky. "What can I do for you?" "Oh my," said Mr. Glum, sticking his fingers in his ears. "How can you stand this awful noise? I was going to visit with you for a while, but I can't hear myself think. Goodbye, Mr. Winky. Goodbye." Mr. Glum pulled his hat down over his ears and hurried out, slamming the door behind him. At first, Mr. Winky laughed. Then he felt hurt. "Well, you could have tried to be a little more polite," he murmured. Then he tried to think of something clever to say to Mr. Glum the next time he saw him. He tried and tried, but he couldn't think of a single thing. "Why," he cried, sticking his fingers in his ears, "this place is so noisy, I can't hear myself think." He jumped up from his workbench, pulled his hat down on his head, and hurried out, slamming the door behind him. "It's nice and quiet out here," he said as he walked briskly down the street. He looked to the right and to the left and was just about to step off the curb when squonk! A taxi horn blew and screech! Some brakes squealed. Mr. Winky jumped a foot in the air as a taxi whizzed by. "Whew! That was a narrow squeak," he said. He looked up and down the street again, and then he stepped off the curb. Clang, 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 screeched a trolley car. Ow! howled Mr. Winky. He pulled his hat down on his head and he ran as fast as he could to the railroad station. "I must get out of the city," he said. "It's so noisy I can't hear myself think." He bought a ticket to the country. As the train rushed through the countryside, he settled in the plush red seat and opened a bag of peanuts. Snap, crackle, crunch, 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 crunch. Mr. Winky ate peanuts. Woo, woo, woo! The train whistled. Pickety, pickety, pockety, puck, pickety, pickety, pockety, puck. The wheels clattered over the rails. Clickety, click, click, click. The conductor punched tickets. "Oh my," said Mr. Winky, sticking his fingers in his ears. "I can't stand this noise. I can't hear myself think." He put the rest of the peanuts in his pocket and he got off the train at the next stop. As Mr. Winky walked down slowly through a dusty country lane, he saw a little red farmhouse. Come in, said the farmer. "You're just in time for dinner." Mr. Winky went out to the pump to wash his hands. Squeak, squeak. The pump handle hopped up and down and the cold water splashed into the bucket. Mr. Winky washed his hands and went into the house. Dinner was delicious. Mr. Winky's plate was piled high with rosy ham, mashed potatoes, green peas, and applesauce. But the jangling of the knives and forks and the clattering of the dishes were too much for him. "I can't stand this noise," he said, sticking his fingers in his ears. "Oh my, I can't hear myself think." He finished his dinner quickly, thanked the farmer, and hurried upstairs to bed. "I'll take a walk in the wild woods," he said the next morning. "Surely it'll be quiet there." Mr. Winky walked farther and farther into the wild woods. It was very quiet. "Ah," said Mr. Winky, "this is more like it. At last I can hear myself think." He set his hat on top of his head and walked briskly through the trees. "Chee!" clattered a red squirrel. Mr. Winky walked a little faster. "Caw!" screamed a raggedy black crow, swooping down through the shadows. Mr. Winky began to run. Leaves crackled and branches snapped as he ran. "Ouch!" howled Mr. Winky when he bumped into a tree. "Ow!" howled Mr. Winky when he tripped over an old stump. And "Oh my!" gasped Mr. Winky when he ran smack into a big brown bear. "Grrr!" roared the big brown bear, sitting up on its hind legs. Mr. Winky turned right about face and ran. "Grrr!" said the bear. "Caw!" said the crow. "Chee!" said the red squirrel. "I can't stand this noise," muttered Mr. Winky, and sticking his fingers in his ears, he hurried out of the wild woods. He hurried past the little red farmhouse and past the pump and down to the railroad station. There, he bought a ticket back to the city. As the train rushed through the countryside, he settled back in the red plush seat and began to eat peanuts. Snap, crackle, crunch, 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 crunch. Mr. Winky ate some peanuts. Woo, woo, woo! The train whistled. Pickety-pick, pockety-pock, pickety-pick, pockety-pock. The wheels clattered over the rails and clickety-click, click, click. The conductor punched tickets. Mr. Winky got off the train when it reached the city and started toward its clock shop. Clang, 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 screeched a trolley car. Whee! Shrieked the siren on a big fire engine. Squonk, squonk, squonkity squonk, tooted a taxi horn. Mr. Winky waited and watched for his chance, then scuttled across the street and hurried into his shop. He didn't wait to take his hat off before he went over to his workbench. But something was wrong. What was the matter? Mr. Winky looked all around uneasily. He looked at his workbench. All his tools were in place. He opened the drawer where he kept his money. All his money was there. He looked for his glasses. They were right where they belonged, on his face. What could be wrong? Oh my, said Mr. Winky. It's quiet in here. There isn't a sound. And sure enough, there wasn't a single tick or talk to be heard. The clocks hadn't been wound, and they had all stopped. I can't stand this silence, roared Mr. Winky, sticking his fingers in his ears. He went right to work and began winding the clocks. He wound the big ones and the small ones. He wound the cuckoo clock and the grandfather clock and the tinkly little Swiss clock. Soon, all the clocks began to talk. Tickety-tick, tickety-tick, whispered the little clocks. Talk, talk, said the big ones. Cuckoo, 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 whistled the cuckoo clock. The grandfather clock chimed a cheery bong, bong, and the Swiss clock never stopped singing its tiny, tinkly song. Now this is the way I like it, said Mr. Winky, holding a clock close to his ear. I dearly love a cheerful shop. And who wants to hear himself think anyhow? The end. Wow. Well, everybody, Mr. Winky sure learned something about himself, didn't he? He learned that he had a favorite sound. It was the sound of clocks. Clocks ticking, clocks chiming, clocks banging, clocks ringing, clocks cuckooing, clocks doing clocky things in clockish manners, like a clock ought to, like a clock should. What's your favorite sound? Do you have a favorite sound in the whole world? Is it music? Is it the sound of a jackhammer? Is it the sound of your pet or your little sister or your auntie or your grandma or grandpa? Is it the sound of Mr. Michael doing Mr. Winky's voice? Is this your favorite sound in the world? If so, boy, it's a lucky day for you, because I've never done that voice before, and now you've just discovered this. You learned something about yourself like Mr. Winky did. My favorite sound, I wonder, my favorite sound is, maybe it's a really nice sounding guitar. Maybe it's the sound of birds chirping in the morning while I'm drinking my coffee and reading my book and wearing my tie. That might be my favorite sound in the whole world. What's yours? What's your favorite book? I got a crazy idea. I know you've never heard of this idea before. I think you should come up with what your favorite book is, and you should comment in the comment section below, because then I can read it next time on Storytime with Mr. Michael. Hey, I'm going to give a special shout out and thank you today to Kiernan and Cooper for this wonderful coffee mug I'm drinking my coffee out of. Thank you guys very much for my new coffee mug. Thank you for coming and watching Storytime with Mr. Michael. Thank you for being part of this wonderful journey through the joy and beauty of books. And no matter what you do out there, everybody, keep reading and stay curious. And I'll see you next time on Storytime with Mr. Michael. All right, bye everybody.